Before we get started, I want to go over some PHP's concepts that you should be aware of. I want to make it clear that this isn't a PHP basics course. I expect you to know PHP and some of the fundamental concepts such as variables and functions. With that being said, there are some techniques and concepts that you will see me use throughout this course. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. Right now, I'm on a site called Write PHP Online. I'll provide a link to this in the resource section of this lecture. I promise that we'll only be using this tool for this lecture only. So the first thing I want to go over is the file constant. I'm going to echo out this constant and run the code. This constant will always contain the full system path to the file it's being used in. It's very important that you understand what the value returns when you use it. Each PHP file you create will automatically define this constant for you. You also don't have to worry about conflicts between each file. Throughout this course, we'll be working inside multiple directories. When you're working inside multiple directories, it can be rather difficult to determine where you are. The file constant will help us greatly. The next concept I want to go over is arrays. I'm going to create an array named R, and it will contain the values 1 through 5. Arrays aren't anything special and aren't hard to understand. What I want to highlight is the way I'm writing arrays. I don't use the keyword array. Instead, I just use square brackets. This is the shorthand way of writing arrays. I know some people like to use the array keyword, but I won't be doing so just to speed things up. If you prefer to use the array keyword, then that's perfectly fine. I do want to give a warning. Not all hosts support the shorthand version of writing PHP arrays. So use these with caution if you plan on supporting older versions of PHP. The next thing I want to go over are anonymous functions. I'm going to type one up quickly. An anonymous function is exactly what it sounds like. It's a function that does not have a name. Since it does not have a name, you have no way to reference it. The reason you would use anonymous functions is to write less code. If you write less code, then your code becomes more readable. I'm going to delete my example and paste in a more practical one. There's quite a bit going on here, so let me break down what's going on. I'm creating a new array called ArrayDouble. This will be assigned to the value returned by the function ArrayMap. The ArrayMap function will take in an array and call a function that will be passed in the value to manipulate it. The function passed in must return either the value, a modified version of the value, or a completely different value. In this example, I'm showing two ways of passing in a function. In the first example, I'm passing in an anonymous function. In the second example, I'm creating a named function and passing in the name to the ArrayMap function. Both solutions are completely valid and acceptable. After both of these, all I'm doing is printing the array. Let's run the code and see what we get. As expected, we get two arrays that are identical. Both methods work and one isn't better than the other. You're more than free to use either one. Throughout this course, we'll be using a combination of both. The last concept you should be aware of is object-oriented programming, also known as OOP. OOP is a pretty complex topic and I couldn't possibly cover it in this single lecture. Instead, I'm going to refer you to a tutorial series which is completely free. In this series, a lot of things related to object-oriented programming is covered. We actually won't be writing a lot of OOP throughout this course, so you're okay with just knowing the bare minimum. If you're already comfortable with OOP, then you can just skip on ahead. That's pretty much it. I just wanted to highlight those concepts to you. There's one last thing I want to show you. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the WordPress Best Practices page. WordPress provides a guideline for writing code. If you plan on contributing to the WordPress core, then these guidelines are important. However, if you just plan on making your own plugins and themes, then you can follow any coding style you like. I'm going to click on the PHP Coding Standards link. Basically, this page goes over how you should write your code from indentation to formatting blocks of code. You are absolutely not required to follow these standards. With that being said, let's give this page a read and go over these standards together. The first thing it goes over is when to use single quotes or double quotes. From WordPress's perspective, it generally doesn't matter. The most important thing is that you escape your data when combining HTML and dynamic data together. Up next is indentation. There's a whole debate whether you should use tabs or spaces, but WordPress recommends you use real tabs and not spaces. Something that's also worth noting down is that WordPress prefers you align your code for readability. In this example, you can see that the equal sign is perfectly aligned no matter how long the variable name gets. Afterwards, you're told you should always use braces when writing blocks of code. Even if your block of code is only one line inside, you should still use braces. This applies to loops, conditional statements, functions, classes, and anything else you can think of that uses braces. When it comes to using conditional statements, you may end up using an else if statement. You can write this one of two ways. You can write the else if with a space or without a space. WordPress recommends no spaces. I'm going to skip regular expressions as we won't be using them that much throughout this course. Down a little further, you'll see that you should use the longhand version of opening and closing PHP tags. You should never use the shorthand version because it's not supported on most hosts. On top of that, you'll see that you should take the time to format your code as opposed to having an unreadable mess in this example. After this, you'll see that WordPress recommends you space everything inside functions and loops neatly. Omitting the spaces can really make it hard to read your code, especially if you're dealing with variables versus hard coding things in. Moving right along, you'll then be told that you should take the time to format your SQL queries. They don't provide a good example here, but you'll see soon enough how to format your queries for readability. Right after this, you'll be told about making queries directly to the database. Throughout most of this course, we'll be using functions that will take care of querying the database and sanitizing the data. However, these functions will not cover all scenarios. In these cases, I'll show you how to properly query the database and make sure it's safe for execution. Up next, it's telling us about naming conventions. Whenever you create variables, classes, or functions, it's recommended you use underscores if your code contains multiple words. If you're someone who uses camel case, then you may want to consider switching. There's also rules for how you should name your files. If there are multiple words, then you should use hyphens to separate those words. I'm going to skip these next two as they're more WordPress-specific topics which we'll cover soon enough. Now we're at ternary operators. Ternary operators are a shorthand way of writing conditional statements for setting values. They're really handy and can even be readable if used right. Just make sure you space everything right and that it makes sense when you read it. You'll see plenty of examples of ternary operators throughout this course. Then we run into Yoda conditions. It's a strange name, but this simply states that when writing conditional statements with variables, you should place the variables on the right side. In this example, it's read like this. If true the force, then victorious you will be. I am not really a fan of this, but you can use it if it makes sense to you. Lastly, it's telling us that you should choose readability over clever code. What this means is that you shouldn't write your code just for the sake of writing less code. While being clever with your code does mean writing less, it can also be harder to read for anyone else that'll want to get into your code. There's more here, but we can safely ignore these. You can read them if you want. Now, I do want to say that these standards are only recommendations. You won't receive errors or warnings from writing your code differently. The point of these standards is so that there's consistency across the board. At the end of the day, it's up to you. I, myself, follow some of these. You'll notice that throughout this course, I like to organize and format my code. You're more than free to follow along with my coding style. Even though it does take some time to get used to, I believe it is worth it. It makes my code more readable and approachable.
Alright, that's it. Let's move on to developing a theme.